We're looking at Acts, and y'all already know the pattern that we've covered Jerusalem, and we've covered Judea and Samaria, and Paul has been taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. And we know that for Acts to be fulfilled, the gospel needs to go where? For Acts to be completed, to go, for the good news to go to the ends of the earth.
Let's go to Rome.
Okay, Paul has got to get to Rome. Now, it's interesting. There are some people that study Scripture that believe that was another book, that Acts was the second volume of a 3-volume work. The Gospel was 1 volume, and this was the second, and there was another volume where that talks about the apostles being martyred. Peter being martyred, Paul being martyred in Rome. Because they see Acts as an incomplete story. Now, that's what they've suggested. I don't agree with that, because what Jesus lays out in the first chapter of Acts, with the gospel going to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, would seem to be fulfilled by the way Luke writes, and we'll see that later, the end of his gospel. In other words, if he brought in martyrdom, that would really undermine what he seems to establish right at the beginning, that the spread of the gospel is incredibly successful. And although different people, and we've seen people killed, like Stephen, by and large, it's really, the outreach is very, very successful. That seems to be a theme there. And especially when we look at Paul in Rome, we'll see later.
Why do they consider Rome the ends of the world?
Well, in the Roman world, yes. Rome would be the center of the world that counts. It would be the city of Rome.
Okay.
And so if the gospel gets to Rome, then there's access. And particularly in the way Luke closes, and like I said, we'll talk about it later. But he talks about Paul being unhindered. So it would sure seem as though Luke wants to establish that, based on the pattern he's already worked through, being in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and now to the ends of the earth, that each place is complete. So it's not, and then if you have another volume where, okay, this is the real problems that are occurring, it almost undermines this gospel of success and might discourage the church that's receiving it. So that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Most people don't believe there's a third volume, but some do. And you may read somebody that says there's a missing volume, just like the Gospel of Mark, that Mark can't end where it does. There must be something missing. So they add something.
Well, I know there were books that they didn't include, right?
There were a lot of books they didn't include, and sometimes we don't even realize. We kind of get the idea that this is it, but there was a lot of stuff circulating around. Remember, Paul's letters are included, so people were writing letters. Christians were writing letters to churches. Paul may have written a whole bunch of letters that disappeared. Yeah. The early church, though, looked at what was being circulated, and they made a decision. And I believe a decision shaped by the Holy Spirit, that these works that are in the canon are distinctive in that they continue to be inspired by the Holy Spirit. Doesn't mean that the other stuff is worthless. Doesn't mean that the other stuff is wrong. It may reflect what a lot of people believed. The early church and I don't believe those works are inspired. But there's stuff that is really very old as the Gospels. Mm-hmm. There's a Gospel of Thomas that's very, very old. You could tell by the papyri that was early church. And it's just a collection of sayings that Jesus offered. Jesus doesn't do anything. So it's not stories about what he does, but it's just his teachings. And there's a lot of the teachings in the Gospel of Thomas that are similar to the teachings in the Gospel, like almost identical. So they're drawing on the same source. The early church knew about Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas. They judged that that was not inspired, that this work wasn't inspired. There was a Gospel of Peter. But Gospel of Peter is a little bit out there. Most of the stuff that wasn't included tend to come from a very specific perspective. A lot of it was what was called Gnostic, that involved secret wisdom to relate to a God that you can't really understand. To sort of connect to the spiritual world. And so when the early church saw something that seemed to have that perspective, they said, and it's stuff that was written later. But geez, there were a lot of adventure stories. There were a lot of acts. Most of them were apostles doing adventure things, fighting dragons and saving damsels.
I wonder, were there really dragons?
No.
They didn't.
No. Well, and understand, people haven't changed that much. If I am a Christian and believe, and I don't have there's no Bible, there's nothing written down, there's no standard you could say, you point here, this is the basis of what we believe. You're not there yet. You're just talking about oral stories. And I want the gospel of Jesus Christ to be popular. I can sit down and talk to them about, now this is what Jesus said. This is what's passed down. And people will say, huh. But if I sit down and say, I'm going to share with you Christianity, and you wouldn't believe what God enabled, Paul to do. I mean, there was a woman who was trapped in a castle, and Paul scaled the wall to save her. And people are doing what? Who are listening?
Probably laughing.
Yeah, well, maybe laughing, or they're doing leaning forward. Yeah, tell us more. Well, let me tell you about Thomas fighting a dragon. Really?
It's like watching ER.
Well, in some ways, it's when we watch a movie about Jesus, I'll guarantee you, Jesus is probably going to look pretty good, because they want people to look and say, that's worth watching for the third night. Different things happen in the story that engage the viewer, and that's what they're doing. They tell stories to engage the listener so that they listen to them. Now, I don't know that their motivation is bad, because they want people to believe in Jesus, and since there's nothing written, they kind of create their own. They also write things to fill in gaps. What did Jesus do as a boy? What was his boyhood? There's nothing in the Gospels about his boyhood. Just that he was presented at the temple. That was it in the Gospels. So what did he do as a boy? Well, people started writing. This is what Jesus did as a boy. And they're also out there. They are really out there. He's doing miracles. Jesus killed a lot of people when he was a boy. You don't cross Jesus, because Jesus will get you.
Who said that?
Well, in some of the stories. There's a story in one of the infancy Gospels. Well, but you're teaching a lesson to a kid. You got to follow the rules. Well, I don't know that. Well, let me tell you about the story about Jesus. He was playing with some friends around a mud puddle, and they were making little birds out of mud. Well, I do that. Oh, but this is Jesus. They'd make these little figures out of mud, and Jesus would breathe on them, and they'd flutter away. They'd fly away. Wow. Well, a bully came by, and they were having such a good time, and stomped on the mud puddle, so they couldn't play anymore. Big mistake, because Jesus, boom, zapped him. Gone. Jesus is at school, teacher teaching him. Now this is none of it inspired. This isn't in the Bible. This is in these things that people have written. Teacher teaching him. Jesus, what's the first letter in the alphabet? Jesus says Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Mm-hmm. Teacher says, very, very good. What's the second letter? Jesus says, I will not give you the second letter until you explain to me the meaning of the first. I mean, he's a kid talking back to his teacher. In the day, what do teachers do when kids talk back to them? So the teacher has raised his hand. You know, a little bit of discipline. Big mistake. You don't raise your hand to Jesus. Teacher falls over dead. And in fact, in the story, Mary and Joseph were having a hard time finding teachers for Jesus but these were stories that people wrote, you know, to fill in these gaps that they made up. These are made up stories.
That made it more exciting.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Makes it more exciting. Makes it more crowd appealing. You know, which, you know, sometimes we tend to do. We tend to do the same thing to make it more appealing, more attractive. So we kind of add our own spin to it.
Well,
So.
When I have to say something, it just pops out.
yeah, well, that's good. Okay, so we're in at the beginning of the 25th chapter, and what has happened where is Paul?
He's in jail.
Okay, Paul's in jail. And how did Paul end up in this bad situation?
The Jews were jealous of it.
Okay,
Yes.
Jews where?
Were jealous of it.
Where were they jealous?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Okay, Paul's in Jerusalem, right? And the Jews, we know the Jews are jealous, but if they're jealous of him, they gotta have a reason, right? To get rid of him. Jealous, they want him out of the picture, right? Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening in Jerusalem that the Jews used to try to get Paul out of the picture?
They made up stories.
They made up a story. Not unlike I was just talking to you about it here. They made up a story. And what was the story they made up to get him?
That Jesus was going against the law of the Jews.
Okay, that Paul was going against the law, in particular about what?
The temple.
The temple. That Paul had done what?
Taken a whatever you call it.
Gentile.
That's it. Yeah.
Taken a Gentile into the temple, which is against Jewish law. Now, had Paul done that?
No.
No. We know because Luke tells us he didn't do that. But that's what the Jews are saying. And that's the way they're going to get rid of him. And in fact, what do they do to initially try to get rid of him? Because they don't initially arrest him, right? What do?
They imprison him.
Well, who ends up imprisoning Paul? Because it isn't the Jews that imprison him.
The head guy that the
Commander.
Yeah, the commander, the Roman commander. So why does the Roman commander have to imprison Paul?
so he doesn't get killed.
So he doesn't get killed. Because how are the Jews trying to kill him? If the Jews aren't arresting him
Stunned.
and then kill him, what do the Jews end up doing to try to get rid of Paul?
Stunned.
What's that?
They want to move? No.
Well, what do they end up doing initially?
Chaining him.
Well, that's true. That's what the Romans do. But what do the Jews initially... How would the Jews try to get rid of this guy that they accuse of taking a Gentile into the office? Into the temple. Yeah, I guess that's an office in a very broad sense.
Shelley's
They try to stir up the crowd, right? They turn the crowd into a mob, right?
Yeah.
Because if you have to bring him to a trial, then you got to have evidence and all kinds of jazz. If you stir up a mob and the mob takes over, they do your work, and that's what they do. Also, as Luke is shaping this, we need, so the Jews, the leaders who are jealous of Jesus, stir up this mob, right? And they're going to and the irony is, Paul is actually in the temple to show that he does obey the law. But they're saying he went in violation of the law. And the crowd is stirred up and they're trying to get him, right? And they are out of control. Who saves him?
The Romans.
The Romans step in and save him. And they bring him in, and he wants to talk to the Jews again, so he preaches a little sermon, and they turn into a mob again, and the Romans save him again. And what is Luke suggesting? about both the Jews, about the leaders, about the mob, about the Romans. As he's shaping this story, what is the message he's communicating to his church? Some, good gracious, maybe 50 years after this happens.
That he's strong and still strong in his faith.
Okay, Paul is strong in his faith. What else?
The Romans are fair.
The Romans are fair.
The Jews are jealous.
The Jews are jealous. Man, he has communicated to that church, and things haven't changed. You can be strong in the face of opposition just like Paul. Jews are still jealous. That's why they don't like you, because they're jealous. Jews still stir up the crowds by telling things that aren't true. But if you're in big trouble and they're coming to get you, where do you turn? You find a policeman. You find a Roman policeman. Because the Romans aren't Christian. They're not all that fond of you either. But they won't be fair to you. You know, and they're going to protect you. They're not going to let the mob get you.
The problem is when they took Paul to jail basically to save his life.
That's right.
You know, and they were easy on him as far as that goes. He could move around and do, you know, he wasn't like real confined type thing.
Right.
Now I don't know what I was going to say after all that explanation.
But it was an excellent explanation. It was a very good explanation.
Oh, I know what it was. Why did they keep it? They never really ruled on him for 5 years.
Well, but Luke tells us. Now remember, Luke is shaping the story. Why doesn't Felix make a judge? He's there for 2 years. He's in Jerusalem, right? Mm-hmm. They end up deciding they're going to, Jerusalem's a bad place for the Romans. That's not a place where the Romans would like to have difficulties, because it's kind of isolated. So they decide they're going to do what?
Take him to Caesarea.
Going to take him to Caesarea. But they're taking him to Caesarea to have a trial. You know, kind of like nowadays, change venue, can't have a fair trial here, move someplace else. Move it to Caesarea. Jewish leaders can go, bring their accusations, we'll have a trial in Caesarea. But the Jews are so focused on, they care so little about justice and fairness, that what do the Jews decide they're going to do?
They lie.
Well, when they were going to move you to Caesarea, they're going to kill him on the way. They're going to ambush him. And so the Romans have to, but Romans are fair. You know, understand, if you look at it just the surface, if Paul just disappeared into a mob, would that be bad for the Romans? Problem out of the way, you know, based on what it writes. Seems like Paul is a pretty big problem, at least is the way Luke presents it. And yet the Romans are driven so much by this sense of fairness and justice, they can't let this Jew, who is also a Roman citizen, they can't let him be taken away by a mob. He's got to get a fair trial. And so they move him under escort to Caesarea. That's where we were last week. The Jews accuse him. And as Paul, and again, this is a lesson Luke is conveying to his church. What does, in both of his speech, or both trials, in front of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem and in front of the Jewish leaders in front of Felix, Paul says, what you're really arguing about is, it's really not about Jesus. The issue isn't about Jesus. The issue really isn't even about me bringing in a Gentile into the temple. That's not the issue. What's the issue?
The Jews are jealous.
Well, he doesn't say, remember, he says the issue is about resurrection. The issue is about resurrection. Now, again, Luke is talking to his church later. You know, remember, like I told you last time, there are no more Sadducees. The only Jews left are Pharisees, and the Pharisees believe in the resurrection. And so what Luke is telling his church is the Pharisaic Judaism that's trying to get you now, we're on the same page. We both believe in the resurrection. of the dead. And the original reason why Jesus was rejected was based on something that we both believe. So maybe we have more in common than you think. You know, this is really kind of a neat lesson to teach a church that's facing pressure, that you really have more in common. Now, the leaders are jealous, but the average Jew, you both believe in the resurrection, and that's pretty important. That's a big deal. Okay, so anyway, right now, as we get into the 5th chapter, Paul is sitting in Caesarea. Luke tells us why Felix didn't finally charge him or let him go, because Felix was
afraid.
He was afraid and expected a payment. Thought Paul would raise money to get out, but that didn't happen. So Felix has been replaced, and at the end of the chapter, we've got a new Roman governor whose name is Festus. Okay, so Festus is there. Now, what assumptions can we make without even knowing about Festus? What are some assumptions we can make about this new Roman governor?
That he doesn't know the facts yet?
He doesn't know the facts yet because Felix didn't know the facts.
Yeah.
And getting the facts was a big deal. Remember? That's what the Romans wanted. They wanted to get, why do the Jews hate this guy so much?
Yeah.
Paul says, well, it's because of the resurrection. We know it's because the Jews are jealous and are more than happy to lie. They got no problem lying, to get what they want. What else?
If they ever found out that they lied, would they be punished for that?
Well, they probably wouldn't be punished, mainly because the job of the Roman governor, we're going to see this here, part of his job is to keep the peace. We got to keep things peaceful. So if the Jewish leaders are being arrested for exaggerating the truth, you could have some real problems.
Yeah,
so
but their exaggeration could kill a man.
Well, could kill a man. What the Romans would do, though, is let's let the man go free and go someplace else. Get him away. Okay? So I think that's kind of where the Romans are.
Okay.
They don't want to antagonize the Jews because that's going to cost money if the Jews rebel. On the other hand, they can't kill Paul, which would be easy for them to do if they were corrupt. They can't do that because they have this sense of justice. So they've got to be fair to him. So the Romans are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Okay? All right, so there he is. What else do we know about Festus? So we know he doesn't know the information. So he's going to have to get the facts. What else can we assume about him?
He'll be fair.
He's going to be fair. He's a Roman. He's a Roman governor. He ain't going to be Christian, but he's going to be fair. He might be curious, but he's certainly going to be fair. Okay, there we are. Chapter 25, verse 1. Who's introduced at the beginning of the chapter?
Festus.
Festus is there, right? And he's arriving at and where does he go? Where does Festus go immediately?
Caesarea to Jerusalem.
Okay, he goes to Jerusalem. Now that's kind of interesting because it would seem, if we look at this as just objective history, for a new governor, the first thing he's doing is checking in on Paul. That would seem to indicate that this deal with Paul is the highest priority for a Roman governor. With all the governors are responsible for, this is the most important thing they face. At least this is how Luke is writing it. This is a high priority. So anyway, he goes to Jerusalem. Why does he go to Jerusalem? Are we surprised by why he goes to Jerusalem, Festus? No, we aren't surprised. Why does he go to Jerusalem?
He wants to find out the truth about it.
He wants to find out the truth. He wants to get the facts, right? And what appeal do the Jews make when Festus gets there to get the facts? What do they ask Festus to do?
Bring Paul back to Jerusalem.
We want you to bring Paul back to Jerusalem. Now, for Festus, not knowing, because he's brand new, right? Why might that be an innocent request?
Because he doesn't know the facts.
He doesn't know the facts. He doesn't know how much the Jews hate him. Bring him back, and we'll take care of it. We'll show justice. But Luke tells us what? What does Luke tell us?
Take some of the leaders along.
Well, what does Luke tell us? Right after they make the appeal to Festus, and Festus, a new governor, okay, granting their appeal will help him because he's new, so they kind of ingratiate himself to them. He would go, have a fair trial in Jerusalem among the people who are so upset, who certainly must know the facts. That seems like a reasonable request, but Luke tells us something. What does Luke tell us? Do the Jews want him to be transferred to Jerusalem so that he can have a fair trial? No. They want to ambush him. They're going to kill him along the way. Again, Luke is giving us insight into the story that the characters, the Jews know, but Festus doesn't know. Okay, we know that, but the governor doesn't. Kind of interesting that they want to kill him. They don't want him to go to trial.
Yeah, because they don't have any proof of anything they said.
Very good. Okay, so they're going to kill him, but they want him out of the way because they are what?
Jealous.
Jealous. Good. How does Festus respond to their appeal?
He asked them to come back.
What's that?
He's going back to Caesarea and they can come back.
Okay, he's going back to Caesarea. They can come with him. In fact, what does he tell them to do?
He would convene the court and that Paul be brought before.
Okay, you come with me, and we can have, since you guys know you want a fair trial for him, right? I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll have a fair trial for him right in Caesarea. You will come on back with me, and we'll have a fair trial. What has Festus just done for Paul?
Saved him.
Saved him. He saved him. Because if Festus had said, well, that sounds right. The offense took place in Jerusalem. He offended y'all. He broke your law, not Roman law, your law. You should take care of it. That would be a reasonable response. But Romans are just. So, not going to do that. You come and you're going to have a trial before me. You're going to have a trial before me. You're not going to be in charge of it. I'm going to be in charge of it. Okay, Festus is just saying Paul. Now, what happens after the conversation? After
He made his defense.
well, even before, he goes back. He stays with him a little while. Then Festus goes back, right? Mm-hmm. And the next day after he's back, what does Festus do?
Asked for Paul to be brought to him.
Paul bring Paul, and when they bring Paul, who's there?
The Jews that came back.
The Jews that came back. So a group of Jews came back with them, and what do they bring? What do they bring with them?
The complaints.
They bring the complaints, right? They bring the charges against him. Only Luke tells us what about the charges.
They can't prove it.
Can't prove it. They can't prove the charges. So he's having a trial, but they can't prove their accusations against him. Now, how does Paul respond to the charges?
He said he's done nothing wrong against the law or the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar.
Okay. Now, why is that important that he mentions all
Caesar.
three?
Well, Caesar's a big dude.
What's that?
Never mind, that isn't the way to say it, but I said Caesar's the big
So,
dude.
yeah, he's a big dude. So, as he's doing it, he hasn't done anything against Caesar. He hasn't broken any
Laws with him.
Roman laws. There's no Roman laws. And in fact, he hasn't broken
Any laws.
Jewish law. And he certainly hasn't defiled the temple, and he hasn't done anything against the Romans. He is innocent, right? Now, what does Festus, because he's a politician, he's a representative of Rome. What does he want to do? Because he's not an idiot.
He's trying to kind of like look between both things and trying to keep it.
Yes, that's right.
You know.
His job is to do what? Keep the peace and do what?
Protect Paul.
Well, he wants to protect Paul on one hand, but he's got to keep the peace. And if the peace is kept, how does that help Rome?
Makes them look good.
Makes them look good. And if Rome looks good, that means the people do what? Which is really important for the Romans.
They listened.
What's that?
A support?
They support him. They pay their taxes. They pay their taxes and they don't riot in the street, because if they rioted in the street, then the Romans would have to do what?
Arrest.
They have to pay for people to arrest them and to try them, and they wouldn't get any money back, and it is a bad deal. It's going to cost Rome money. And Festus is there to keep the peace. So naturally he wants to do the Jews a favor.
Yeah.
He wants to keep them peaceful. So what does he ask Paul?
He asked if he was willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial.
Okay, now, would you go to Jerusalem and stand trial? But what kind of trial is Festus suggesting? Now, we already know if he goes back to Jerusalem, what have the Jews already planned?
To kill him.
They're going to ambush him.
Yeah.
They're going to kill him along the way. Is he going to stand trial, a trial run by the Jews?
No.
No.
Before Festus.
Festus is going to go out there with him. So, do you want to have your trial? Paul, where do you want to have your trial? The Jews want to have the trial
Caesar's
in
court.
Jerusalem. You're here in Caesarea. Where do you want to? I will give you the choice.
Caesar's court.
Okay. And so Paul responds, you choose where you want this trial to take place.
He wants to go to Rome.
I'm appealing to the emperor. Now, why would he have any right to appeal to the emperor?
Because he's a Roman.
Roman citizen.
He's a Roman citizen. Luke has already dropped that into the story, that he's a Roman citizen. So if he's having a trial before the emperor, the tribune, the ultimate tribune, he's going to have the trial there, he's going to need to go to Rome. Now, what does he say again about his accusations?
He hasn't
Not
done
true.
anything wrong.
I have done nothing wrong, and you know it. You know it. Now, what does Paul say about his view of justice? After he says, I've done nothing wrong.
He said he'd like to hand it over to Caesar.
Okay, but what does he say? Because he says, I'm willing to face a trial. Because he doesn't say, you need to let me go, because I haven't done anything wrong. He says, I'll go to trial. Only I want to go to trial in front of the emperor. How does Paul, which again becomes something, Luke's church, is it sort of intended for them to pick up their ear? What does Paul say?
He said if he was found guilty, he'd be willing to die if he did it.
If I am guilty, I'll face the consequences of my action.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm guilty, then I'll face it. Now, what does that say? But don't turn me over to them, to the Jews. Something Festus didn't say. Never said that he was going to turn him over to the Jews, because he was going to have a trial in front of him, but in Jerusalem. But Paul, if I'm guilty, so be it. Now that's really important, because this is an articulation of how this Christian views justice. Again, a lesson that Luke is conveying to his church. As Christians, then maybe we need to view it the same way. If we're wrong, being Christian doesn't mean you're not accountable anymore. It's being accountable for your actions. And if my actions are wrong, then I'll face the consequences. That's part about being a good person, a Christian person. Something the Romans would agree with. Okay, but he is going to appeal to
Caesar.
Caesar. Why would he want to appeal to Caesar?
Caesar would be fair.
Because he knows it's going to be fair. He knows it's going to be fair. And what does Festus do?
He allows them to go.
Now, it's really interesting, just as an aside, when this is happening historically, in a time frame, you know who's the emperor? You know who is sitting as emperor in Rome, to whom Paul is appealing?
Caesar.
Well, Caesar,
Yeah.
but it isn't Julius Caesar. I mean, Julius Caesar is dead. It isn't Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar's long since dead. They're both dead. You know who's Caesar? Who the Caesar is?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you've heard of him.
Agrippa.
Burn. Playing the fiddle while. Yeah.
Nuts.
Nero.
I mean, crazy.
Nero
Yeah.
is the emperor. That's the one to whom Paul is appealing. Now, we look at Roman history and we say, oh my gosh, Nero was,
Crazy.
he was horrible, he was crazy, he was horrible, he was terrible. But again, Luke is conveying a message to his church. You can trust the Romans. You can trust the Romans. Okay, so he's appealing to Caesar. That just happens to be the Caesar to whom he's appealing, Nero. Okay, what does Festus do? So Paul has made his appeal twice. What does Festus do?
Lets him go.
Yeah, first he gets together
His advisors.
his little advisors. He gets together his advisors. And because he wants, and why would he do that? Why would he get his advisors together?
So he wouldn't have to take the blame.
Well, maybe that he didn't have to take the blame, maybe to get their advice, maybe to make sure what he's doing is the right thing. But he's not making the decision arbitrarily on his own. This is something that's coming from a group. And as a result of the conversation with his advisors, Festus says what?
Consult with King Agrippa.
Well, you have appealed to the emperor.
To the emperor Caesar you will go.
To the emperor you will go.
Yep.
We will send you to the emperor. Now that's pretty dramatic, because that means Paul's going to have to be put on a boat and sailed halfway across the Mediterranean Sea. That's a big trip in the ancient world. That's a real big trip. But Roman justice, that's what Roman justice is. Even though it's going to be expensive, even though it's going to be difficult, if you made that appeal, so it'll happen. Now, who just so happens to be there in Caesarea at the same time? Because remember, Festus is new. He's just taking his post, assuming his post. Who happens to be there?
King Agrippa and Bernice.
King Agrippa and Bernice. Now, this is, and I think I told you last week, this is Herod Agrippa II. Remember earlier in Acts, we had another King Agrippa? Do you remember what happened to the first King Agrippa? It was a little aside. It wasn't a major part of the story. It was sort of...
He was killed.
Well, he was killed, but in a different kind of way. Remember way back, when it talks about Agrippa going to Tyre and dressing in dazzling robes and standing in front of the people, and the people started shouting, sort of that he's recognizing him as like a god figure, a heavenly figure. You remember what happened to King Agrippa when he was in front of the crowd?
You killed?
He dropped dead. And when they did the autopsy, remember what they found? He's full of worms.
Oh,
He's full of worms.
Really?
Yeah, so it wasn't a good guy. So that Agrippa, and he was called King Agrippa, And that was this king's father. That was this king's father.
Okay.
So that's why it would be Herod Agrippa the second. And this was the last king in that Herodian line. And remember, they weren't Jews, they were Idumeans, they were Edomites, but they practiced Judaism. And this is Agrippa. He had no sons. Now his kingdom, his grandfather was Herod Antipas, which is the Herod in Luke. During the trial, when Pilate sends him to Herod because Herod's in town, he was a tetrarch. That was his grandfather. And Herod, this Agrippa, ruled the area that his grandfather ruled. So it would have been Galilee and a place called Perea, which is a little further east. So he's there. He doesn't rule from Caesarea, and he doesn't rule in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is part of this Roman province of Judea. His kingdom is someplace else, but he goes to Jerusalem to worship, because that's where the temple is. And he practices Judaism even though he's not a Jew, and the Sadducees wouldn't let him in the temple. So Herod Agrippa couldn't go to the temple either. And he is there. In fact, he left Jerusalem later during the revolution, when the Jews rebelled against the Romans. He supported the Romans. He didn't support the Jews. So anyway, he's in Caesarea with his sister Bernice to welcome Festus, the new governor. And what does Festus do?
Since he was staying there for a little bit, he brought up all the charges against Paul.
Okay, he's going to lay the case before Agrippa, right? Who is king, but not king of any place that's associated with Paul. His kingdom is somewhere else. But he lays the case down. Why would that be? What does that say about the case if he's laying the case in front of this visiting king?
The case isn't solved.
Yeah, it isn't solved, and pretty important that you'd bring. I mean, he's not bringing every case in front of the king. And what does it also suggest about Agrippa? If Festus, the Roman governor, is bringing this case about Paul to King Agrippa, what does that suggest about him?
About who?
Agrippa.
He's fair.
Okay, that he's not one of these Jews that are jealous who want to kill Paul. So Festus is doing with Agrippa sort of what he did with his advisors. He's bringing the case before him. And what does he say as he's bringing this information? What does he say about Paul?
He told. Well, you want to know what he said?
Yeah. What does he say about Paul?
Oh, well, he says that when he went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him,
Okay.
and asked that he condemned.
Right. And then what does he say?
It-
So here's this guy. Charges have been brought by the Jews, and they want me to sentence him. Then what does he say?
He finds nothing worthy of death.
Okay. And what else does he say about Roman justice, a custom of the Romans?
ever turn over any man before he has faced his.
That's exactly right. So even though the Jews want him to say, guilty, here you go, not unlike what Pilate did with Jesus, with the mob.
Yeah.
When he said, I find he's not guilty, and they said, crucify him, and Pilate says, I can't he hasn't done anything. And so Pilate turns him over Jesus over to the crowd, really to the mob. Festus says, that's not the way Romans work. That's not the way we work. You got to face you Romans make sure you face your accusers. So what
Pilate should have did that.
That's exactly right. Pilate should have done that. That's what Pilate should have done. Instead of, because he wimped out.
Well, he did send Jesus to...
He sends Jesus to Herod in Luke. He sends Jesus to Herod because Jesus is from Galilee. And Herod kicks him back to Pilate. And,
They do that because none of them wanted to condemn Jesus because they couldn't
Right.
find anything wrong.
right, but it's, even in Luke's story, Pilate's afraid because of the mob.
Yeah.
And so Pilate says, remember, Jerusalem is a bad place for Romans.
No. Now, in another take on this, that somebody was explaining to me that Pilate did have the power. Like, he wasn't truly afraid of the mob. He had soldiers that could have controlled that mob. That could have, but he did not do what he could have done.
Well, and that's where the story becomes really important, because when we read the Gospels, none of the Gospel writers suggest that. None of the Gospel writers suggest, but Pilate could have released him, and historically Pilate was a jerk. So whether he was afraid of it, historically,
Yeah.
whether that's accurate or not, but the stories in the Gospel, the story says he's scared. That's what it says. So when we're reading that story, we need to assume that really is his motivation, because that's what the evangelist told us, that he was afraid of the mob. He was afraid of them. Whether historically he was or not, who knows? But the evangelists say he did it because of the mob. And therefore the execution is on their heads, not on his. He turns him over to let them do with him
And his wife
what they
didn't want to
please.
turn him over.
Yeah, that's what it says in
So I
Matthew.
kind of feel like he was afraid of, what if this is really true, that Jesus is truly...
Well, it could be, again, in the
But
story.
yet, you know what I mean, it's kind of like towards the mob, but deep down he's like, you know what, I'm thinking this guy really is, but I have no...
I mean, historically, that could be. That's not in any of the gospel stories. So you have to add that in.
Except for
You know.
the dream of his wife.
Right, but that's not in Luke. That's in Matthew. Yeah. But you're right. And the dream of the wife is, don't mess with this guy. This guy's going to be trouble. Killing him's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
So get out of the way. You don't want the blood on your hands. You don't want to mess with this. This is bad news. In the dream.
And then after all that happened, when Jesus was crucified and the temple was desecrated and the curtain torn into two, so now that Paul was going through that, they're not going to just hand him over to the crowds. They're going to make sure that we don't have this.
Well, remember one of the things, and this is something the early church struggles with, and there are a couple of things that early Christians, we don't even think of it now because it's so much a part of who we are and what we've always believed. But this was a problem in the early church. A couple of problems. One, Jesus is baptized. That's a big problem. If baptism involves confession of sin, that's a big problem if Jesus is baptized. That's an issue. That's a problem. Another problem is Jesus dies on a Roman cross. He doesn't die underneath Jewish stones. If he had been stoned to death, then the Jews are responsible for the death. But he was nailed on a Roman cross, which means the Romans are the ones that made the decision. And that becomes a big problem if it's the Jews that are responsible for the death of Jesus. If they're the antagonists in this story, then how does he die on a Roman cross? Well, if you look at the stories,
They couldn't put him to death.
well, if you look on the stories, that's what they're working with. How can the Jews be responsible when the Romans are the ones, when the Roman is the one that says, execute it? How can we hold those Jews accountable? And that becomes an issue in the church, just like the baptism. And each of the evangelists kind of deal with it in a slightly different way. How do we attribute the blame, for the crucifixion? So, yeah, it becomes really interesting. You can't deny the crucifixion, but you got to explain it later. Why is he? Just like with the resurrection, we've been looking at it in the evening study. We looked at Matthew, where the soldiers, are paid off to lie about And at the end, Matthew says, and this story has persisted to this day. So what is he doing? He's trying to explain to his church 50, 60 years later, why do some of the Jews say, well, the disciples told you, resurrection, the disciples told you. Well, there it is. Boom. It's part of his narrative. Bang. There it is. So, it's how do you tell people later, how do you explain things that would cause a person to pause and say, that doesn't make sense. Why is Jesus baptized? Why did he die on a Roman cross? That seems odd.
So he was baptized to fulfill what
Well,
was written.
depends on which evangelist you read. Matthew is, and then I won't finish it, but Matthew he has this long, Mark doesn't seem to care. It just says he was baptized by John. Matthew has John say to him, well, I shouldn't baptize you. You should baptize me. That's in Matthew. And Jesus is to fulfill whatever, to fulfill something. But he doesn't give a prophecy. He doesn't give a quote from the Old Testament to fulfill all righteousness. So he does it. In Luke, it doesn't even mention that John did it. In fact, in Luke, John is arrested before Jesus is baptized. So if you look at the narrative in Luke, John didn't baptize Jesus, which is kind of interesting. And in the Gospel of John, it's the evangelist that describes it. Tells people later, this is what I did. It's not part of a narrative. So each of the evangelists explain this in a slightly different way. And that's what makes Scripture exciting. It also means you got to stay inside the work. If you're studying Matthew, study Matthew. You don't want to pull in Luke and John and include it in the story because it just muddies it. It makes it more confusing. It doesn't reduce confusion, makes it more confusing.
But all through, when you think about it, all through Jesus' ministry, there was, as long as the crowds he was with them, their belief was, Jesus. And when Jesus left for a while, pretty soon the people kind of went back to, where they were, and then he would speak somewhere else, and he had people come up, and it just seems like through his ministry he's had those good and bad things. Just trying to kill him.
Excellent point. Do you remember where in Luke, because we looked at Luke too. Do you remember where in Luke the crowd started to turn? Do you remember what happens in Luke that causes the crowd to turn? And I think this is very intentional. Now, in terms of movement, and Luke is big on movement. I mean, moving to Jerusalem, moving from Jerusalem. That's a big deal seems to be for Luke. He's setting his face to go to Jerusalem, right? In the Gospel of Luke. That's when we're moving towards a conclusion. Luke says that's what he does. He's going from Galilee to Jerusalem. But you remember how Jesus changes?
Oh yeah, it was when he was in the temple and he read the scripture and this is fulfilled in your hearing.
Well, that was at the very beginning. That initiated his ministry. But that was in Galilee. When he starts going in Jerusalem. And both Luke and John and Mark in particular pick this up. It makes it a big deal. Jesus starts talking about, and he had not talked about it before, that the Son of Man is going to have to what?
Die.
Is going to have to die. Is going to have to suffer and die. And when he starts talking about the Son of Man, now to that point he's never mentioned that the Son of Man is going to die. Instead, what has he been doing? What has Jesus been doing before we get to that point? Man, he is what?
Teaching his disciples.
Well, he's called his disciples. What has he been doing with the crowd? And the crowds love it.
Talking to them. And
he's been teaching them. He's been healing them. He's been feeding them. He's been doing miracles. He's been walking on water. He's been, casting out demons. Man, he has been doing all this stuff. And the crowds love it. And then all of a sudden, and Mark is even more dramatic than Luke, but both Mark and Luke do the same thing. Matthew does too. John doesn't. But both of them, you can point your finger at it. He says, first time, Son of Man has to suffer and die. The Son of Man is going to suffer and die and then rise again after 3 days. And when he starts saying that, the first one who objects, who's the first one that objects to him saying that? Peter! You know, the guy that's been the center of all this. Peter's the first one that says, you can't do this. You can't talk about this. And Jesus says,
Yes, I
get
can.
behind me, Satan, because you're doing the same. You're trying to tempt me just like Satan did in the wilderness. You're trying to turn me away from what I'm supposed to be doing. And after he says that, you start seeing the crowds. The attitude of the crowd start changing. The attitudes of the disciples start changing too. They become more clueless after that. They never seem to understand what he's talking about.
No, because they were seeing all this big buildup and they were thinking the kingdom was going to be
Sure.
there.
Sure.
Not-
And if you expected the kingdom to come with drama, geez Louise, feeding 5,000, feeding 4,000, healing people, you know, doves coming down from heaven, Lord have mercy. That's pretty good stuff. That they got to suffer and die. That's not so good. So that's when we start seeing the crowd, the attitude in the crowd change. But we still don't know because they're always in the background. We don't know where they're going to come down, where the crowd is going to come down until we're in Pilate's court. And the crowd does what?
Turns on him.
Turns on him and says, crucify him.
Yeah.
Crucify him. And that's where the crowd takes its stand. That's where it ends up taking its stand.
But it's, you know, it's been through most of his ministry, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Putting him down, Jesus is doing good, and people are believing and loving him and all that. And then the next thing, you know, it doesn't take much to make them all turn.
Yeah, well, that's right.
You know, and if they were really truly that into to Jesus and believing him, you wouldn't think they would all of a sudden join a crowd.
Right.
And, you know.
Which they didn't. They didn't believe in him. They didn't trust in him. And neither did his disciples. You know, they didn't trust in him either because they ran away. Or betrayed him but denied him. All right, he's before. So Agrippa and Bernice, they're there, right? Mm-hmm. Festus is going to investigate, right? What does Agrippa say to Festus?
He wants to hear the man himself.
I'd like to hear him. You know, I'd like to hear him. And Festus says,
He will tomorrow.
okay. And what happens on the next day?
He hears something.
Okay, there he is. But Luke presents Agrippa coming in with great pomp and circumstance, right? And all the important people. He enters the room like a king, right? And then he Festus has Paul brought in, right? Mm-hmm. And then what does Festus say?
Tells him there's a man here whom Felix has as a prisoner.
Okay, he's been here for a while, but he talks about Paul, right? Mm-hmm. The Jewish community wants him dead.
Yeah.
But I don't find any. He summarizes what we already know, right?
Yep.
I don't find anything wrong. He's appealed to the emperor, therefore, to the emperor. He will go.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And why is he bringing him in front of King Herod Agrippa?
To face these charges and because he was going to judge them.
Right. And remember, what have the Romans wanted to do for the last 2 chapters? What's been their motivation? Because remember, the Romans aren't saying, "Oh yeah, we'll just turn him loose," because that wouldn't be fair either.
Yeah.
What do the Romans want?
They're trying to keep the peace.
They want to keep the peace.
And
I want to hear.
They want to hear. Why? What's the charge? Give me proof. You know, tell me why he upsets you so much. Give me something to base a judgment on. And why would the Romans want something to base a judgment on?
They're fair.
Because they are fair. The Jews, on the other hand, the Jewish leaders are not fair. They don't care about fairness. But the Romans do. The Romans do. So here we are. Paul is in front of King Agrippa in all his glory. His sister is there. Every time Paul has been in this kind of situation, and he's been in this situation a lot, what does Paul always do?
Defended himself.
He always preaches. So we are ready, right? Now the sermons have been, depending on the audience, maybe a little different. Always have the same focus, pretty much, except when he was in Athens. But we're going to expect Paul in chapter 26 to do what?
Preach.
To preach a sermon to Agrippa and Bernice. Okay. Now, how has Luke advanced this story? Where are we as a result of passing through chapter 25?
Sort of kind of, it's up in the air because they can't prove anything when it takes to court, and they want him condemned and put to death without any proof at all that he did anything wrong.
Which says what about them?
That they're liars.
Okay. That they're liars. You can't trust them.
Yeah.
Because they'll say whatever it takes.
Yep.
And in fact, even they'll try to get you before you even get to the courtroom. They'll try to mug you and ambush you, kill you before you even get to trial.
And it's done today. There's been people, going to be on trial, and they try to get them at the courthouse.
That's really interesting, because that would be the group that Luke is comparing the Jewish leaders to. The Jewish mob is susceptible. So they kind of do what the leaders fire them up to do. But in the midst of that, who can you trust?
Jesus. Paul.
You could trust the Romans.
All Romans.
You could trust the Romans, because the Romans will take care of you. Man, that's an important lesson for Luke's church. That's a really important lesson for his church. Okay, let's have a word of prayer, and then next week we're getting close to the end, but a lot of exciting things are going to happen as we get closer to the end, because Paul is heading to Rome, but it ain't going to be an easy trip. All right, Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Remind us that the world in which we live hasn't changed all that much. There are people that you can't trust, that'll do whatever they need to do to get away with anything they want to do. And that's just the way it is, and a lot of time that undermines Christianity. A lot of times it's things that are wrong, and yet they'll do it anyway. Remind us that there's still evil in our world. Also remind us that there's also good people, even if they're not Christian. They're still fair and just. And help us to have the insight and ability to identify who they are. But Lord, also remind us that there's no reason why we can't show the same kind of strength Paul showed as he dealt with the opposition he faced. We can stand up and we can speak out, and we can be strong in the face of whatever we have to face. Help us to recognize that. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Amen. So thank you, ladies.
Thank you.